Every day, freight and passenger trains traverse the rugged Sierra, a mountain range that divides the fertile valleys of California from the western deserts of Nevada. You're looking at the top of that Trans-Sierra route, Donner Pass. Donner Pass was named after a pioneer wagon train that was trapped in the winter snows of this region in the mid-1800s. When the West was still a territory, there were no highways, no roads, only animal trails. Now, while the Indians had lived here for several hundred years, the first white men to enter the West were explorers and later trappers. They came to harvest beaver pelts, which were plentiful along the banks of the Humboldt River. Then came the immigrants, looking for a new promise.
Leave the leaders go! Leave them go! Leave them go! 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 Whoa! Whoa! Whoa, easy!
In covered wagons, they crossed the plains and ascended the mountains that led to Oregon and California.
Whoa! Whoa!
Wagon trains, as they were called, were somewhat adequate for moving families to the New West. But conditions along the tortuous route were often harsh and life-threatening. In the snows of winter, only the hardiest survived. Many more did not. In the summer, mile after mile of swirling dust clouds choked their lungs. The parched desert alkali cracked open the hoofs of the animals. Grit and powdery chalk-like dust covered everything in the wagons. Through long desert valleys which seemingly had no end, these pioneer families would travel for days without water. And when they finally did find water, it usually proved to be more of a problem than a blessing.
I can't stop! I can't stop! I can't stop!
Wagon trains had their place, but what the West really needed was a more dependable mode of transportation, a railroad, something to connect east with west. The Indians called these giant engines iron horses, and soon they were crossing America on the Transcontinental Railroad. A roadbed still used today by the Southern Pacific Railroad. Now, there were other railroads in the West, some quite famous. This as an example. The Virginia and Truckee, crossing the Truckee River on a bright, sunny morning. The V&T, as it was called for short, was known as the Golden Girl of the short line railroads. The entire roadbed was less than 50 miles long, but in that short distance, it carried millions of dollars in silver from the Comstock mines of Virginia City. Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, built a series of classic steam engines with large drive wheels that could negotiate the sharp turns to Virginia City. The rails were shipped all the way around the Horn from Sheffield, England, where they were originally forged. These old V&T engines are highly prized in collections all around the country. Many were sold off to movie companies, which most likely saved these grand old iron horses from being cut up for scrap metal during the Second World War. Today, perhaps the best collection of V&T engines can be viewed in Carson City, Nevada, at the Permanent Rail Museum south of town. This is one of the early V&T engines called the Inyo. Like all the other engines at this museum, it's been meticulously restored to its original gleaming perfection. The boiler is wood-fired, and the brass is usually all shined up like Sunday. On select weekends, they open the doors, fire up the boilers, and roll out the engines. Now, occasionally, the engines pull onto this device that looks like a bridge. Actually, it's a large hand-operated turnstile, sort of like an overgrown merry-go-round for trains. They use it to rotate the engines off of one track and onto a new track in a short distance, so the train can move in a new direction. They blow the whistles, clang the bells, and you can take rides on these wonderful old trains in Carson City. Nevada had a few other railroads, but they're all long since faded into the history books. They ripped up the rails, cut up the engines for scrap, and the sound of their once majestic passing is but a whisper on the wind as it blows across the open desert. However, something went wrong, wonderfully wrong. You see, there was one Western railroad that miraculously survived. And what a railroad! You are about to discover what experts say is the most complete working example of an early steam railroad anywhere in the United States. It's complete because the railroad and all the shops were used right up until 1983. The water tower, it's still here. The car shops, the passenger terminal, the dispatcher's office, everything. This wonderful old steam railroad is so complete, it's like a ghost from the past resurrected. Officially, it's called the Nevada Northern Railway. But for those who know her best, she's affectionately called the Ghost Train. In the northeast corner of Nevada is one of America's newest natural parks, the Great Basin National Park and magnificent Wheeler Peak. Inside the park is Lehman Caves, where over the centuries, water, rich in soluble limestone, has deposited fabulous formations from the ceilings and onto the floor of the caves. While the caves are deep inside the mountain, the flanks of this lofty peak support the oldest living things on the face of the earth, the bristlecone pine forest. Clinging to the rocks above 9,000 feet, the bristlecones have lived here in freezing cold and isolation since before the coming of Christ. Now, nearby all this grandeur is the thriving town of Ely, Nevada. It was but a few miles west of here that Mother Nature cleverly deposited in the ground one of the largest copper ore bodies in the world. To mine that ore and to provide transportation for passengers and freight, Mark Requa built the Nevada Northern Railroad in 1905. When completed in September of the following year, the last spike to be driven was of solid copper. In case you're wondering, that spike is still kept in a dusty old display case on the campus of the University of Nevada, Reno. Now, like all of Nevada's other steam-powered railroads, the Nevada Northern was built primarily for mining, hauling the copper ore from the pit at Copper Flat to the smelter at McGill, which was 27 miles away. In all, there were 165 miles of rail laid so the Nevada Northern could connect to the Union Pacific line at Cobre. They needed a fast engine that could go the distance in short order, hauling passengers and freight. So, from Baldwin Locomotive Works came number 40. She was a 4060 engine, weighing in at a petite 75 tons. Can you believe this engine was actually built for speed? Her main drive wheels were 68 inches high, and rumors have it, she could fly like the wind.
Nevada Northern passenger train had the fastest schedule of any train in the country. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but I've heard 3 or 4 of them claim that. And I have ridden that old 40 at better than 80 miles an hour out there on the main line. I can't remember whether it was Pop Hartman or Roy Noble used to run it.
Mm-hmm. Both of them
But,
One of those engineers told me they clocked that at 96 miles an hour one time across Dolly Warden.
because like I say,
We gathered together a group of retired Nevada Northern Railroad men who shared their experiences.
you can watch them mile boards go by and look at your watch and time it at 80 miles an hour. That, like, killed myself out there at Shafter one day getting off of it. I'm used to these freight engines, you know, the exhaust on them. You never pay any attention how fast you're going. You just listen, kind of subconsciously. I got off this, went down there at that switch to head them in on the pass there, Shafter, and I got on the engine riding up, and I just thought to myself, when it gets going fast enough, I'll get off. And I was just listening, you know, shooting the bull with a hog head, and pretty soon I'd start to get off. Man, that old high-wheeled 40 was turning over there, but we was doing about 40 miles an hour. And I got off, I tore up dirt from here to the office building over there. Didn't fall down, but I was sure taking some long steps.
You know, they don't have to turn over very fast to be doing 40 miles an hour, those old drivers.
I learned that the hard way out there that day.
Number 40 hauled passengers and freight from 1910 through 1941. When buses and cars became more popular, Number 40 was retired. But before she was tucked away for a Rumpelstiltskin nap, the railroad completely overhauled the engine. Then it was pulled into the barn for the last time, where it has remained in storage ever since. When the price of copper declined sharply, the mines and eventually the railroad were closed. As a gesture of goodwill to the community, Kennecott Copper Corporation donated a major share of the railroad to stand as a working museum. We decided to find out more, so we packed up our broadcast cameras and headed out to Ely. We got to the yard early on a spring morning before sunrise. We poked around the shops to find out what makes an old railroad, and here's what we discovered. This small car was used by the weighmaster to check the accuracy of the railroad scales. Freight was shipped by the pound, just as it is today, so you can bet your bootstraps accuracy was important. Inside the old shops, everything was just as it had been the day the railroad closed. You could still smell the musty, aromatic scent of old leather and canvas. With the sunlight streaming through the panes of glass, it cast an eerie light into the early mist of morning. The stately passenger cars gave off an occasional cracking noise as the wooden coaches expanded in the warmth of the sunlight. There were smoking cars for the gentlemen and non-smoking cars for the ladies, thank you. Such was life back in 1910. The smoking cars had brass match strikers on the wall, leather seats so the ashes wouldn't catch fire, and brass spittoons on the floor for the tobacco juice. Overhead, chandeliers made of Czechoslovakian stained glass hung from empire ceilings. The walls were made of inlaid wood with gold leaf stencil. Now, this device is a steam-powered rotary snowplow, only one of 7 in existence. And here is the slag pot, a special car designed to haul off the molten slag from the copper smelter. This big pot tilted to one side to dump its fiery load into the slag pile. There was lots of old rolling stock parked on the sidings between the shops. Why, they've even got the original caboose. The Nevada Northern won several safety records over the years, as you can see by the signs. And back then, they didn't care for traveling salesmen any more than we do today. But make no mistake, this was a proud line that was run by the numbers. I talked with Museum General Manager Dick Reynolds.
I think that this railroad is very unique, simply because there's a little of everything they've ever had is still here. And it's amazing how they've preserved the original feel of the railroad going all the way back to 1906 when it was completed. But for instance, there's a room full of the old Edison glass jars for the original telegraph line. These were the Edison batteries that powered the first telegraph, and for some unknown reason they're still here. We're of course delighted that they are.
And this is all part of the museum now, all of these parts? And
Yes. This is an unusual museum in that it's just the way the railroad ended service in 1983, when there was no more need for the railroad line. Why, it's been preserved, and we like to show it to the public just as it is. The general offices, the machine shops, the roundhouse, the car shops, and we've just left everything just the way the railroad left it. They were right in the middle of a project of repairing a wheel set for one of the diesel locomotives, and the day they stopped, the axle was still in the lathe, and it's still there 5 years later. And I think that Kennecott has done a marvelous job in presenting not only the steam engine and its train, but these marvelous facilities basically to the community of Ely.
meanwhile, outside by the engine house, they were rolling up the door in anticipation of our filming. And there she was, number 40. Overnight, the firemen had banked a fire in her boiler so the firebox and water jackets would stay warm. There was just enough pressure in the boiler to bring her out the door. The young fireman talked with Nevada Northern veteran T.J. Buck Lanny about the engine. Then they emptied the ashes from the firebox, just like you open the grates on the bottom of a stove. Meanwhile, a front-end loader started putting coal into the tender. It wasn't as quaint as the old coal chute, but at least it worked. Of course, it was pretty plain to see old Buck wasn't real sure about that big Michigan loader so close to his 78-year-old steam engine. Front-end loaders. Shoot, this ain't no way to run a railroad. Next, they opened the blow-off valve to eject excess water from the boiler. Enough museum, said I. Let's do some serious railroading. They went by the coal chute and brought the engine to a stop. Then, with 3 sharp reports on the whistle, the train came out of the hole as the engineer cleared the stacks. It's amazing, the unlimited power of steam. Imagine moving a 75-ton engine plus the tender from a dead stop up to 15 miles per hour in just a few seconds. They took the engine back inside the car shop, there to hook up to the passenger cars. I'll never forget that wonderful sound the engine made inside the shop. Then, with a gentle nudge, we eased forward with the cars in tow. We attached one of our miniature Skyfire CCD cameras to the side rod of the engine. The side rod is the long rectangular steel beam that attaches the main drive wheel to the other drive wheels. As we move, notice how the right side of the screen appears motionless. That's the side rod onto which the camera is attached. But on the left side, look how the ground goes up and down like we're riding in a seasick boat. That's because the side rod moves up and down and forward and back as it turns the drive wheels. We cruised on out of the yard toward the main line to make a run up the mountain. But first, we had to get the train turned around and onto the main track. Now, if you have a turnstile similar to what we showed you in front of the V&T Museum earlier in the program, you can turn a very large locomotive around in a very short distance. But if you don't, it takes a whole lot of real estate to get a baby like this headed in the right direction. The engineer gives 3 short blasts on the steam whistle, which means the train is going to back up. As we turn up the siding, which curves away from the main yard track, we hit a bit of a slick spot, you know, placed there by wild, deep forest gnomes during the night. Watch what happens to the drive wheel as it loses traction on the steel track. This loss of traction is especially hard on the locomotive's tires, which can separate from the wheel under too much friction heat. Did I say tires? That's right, but not the Goodyear kind. These big drive wheels have tires, which are steel rings sweated onto the main drive wheel. They're more than 1 inch thick and must be replaced periodically in the shops. Now back to the siding. They throw the switch and the train moves forward onto a new siding. They throw yet another switch, and the train begins to back up onto the old siding. As we roll down the track, here is a view from under one of the Nevada Northern's old wooden passenger cars.
Well, in the early days, why cars were built out of wood. They had wooden center frames and center beams and side beams, and therefore the truss rods were used to give them strength. And it's just like a truss bridge. And of course this gave rise to the old, you heard the expression, riding the rods. In the early days, why people that didn't want to pay a ticket to ride the passenger train, why they could climb under a freight car and climb onto these rods and be about a foot above the tracks.
Wasn't that dangerous?
But well, I think it was, but it was a means of transportation for a lot of people, particularly during the Depression.
The train must pass one more switch before it can pull onto the main track. Listen to the sound of this engine. We mounted our portable cameras all over the engine to give you an unusually close first-hand look at what it's like to go down the track on a steam locomotive. Naturally, we were concerned about vibration, so we made a short test run to check our systems before climbing the mountain. That's cameraman John Ford of our staff in the red shirt up on the engine, recording a little bit of sound. Here's our test run, the way it came down from all camera angles in full stereo sound. Looked pretty good from where I was shooting. They finally got the train shut down and then slowly backed up into position for our run. The engineer, Earl Newb, dropped the Johnson bar forward, cracked the throttle, and those big steam pistons on old number 40 came to life. Anticipation was running pretty high in the crew. We've shot a lot of high-speed jet aircraft and mounted our cameras all over the place on classic World War II fighters. But this was my first ride on the front of a hot, dirty, sooty, sweaty, steam-powered locomotive. Was I excited? George Bush, read my lips. I was pumped. Now the train began up a gentle incline that parallels the town of Ely on our left. From the camera inside the high railer that's just in front of the engine, it's a pretty bumpy ride, a lot more than we had imagined. But even with all the vibration, it still provides a marvelous view of the engine. From the station in East Ely to the top of the mountain where the line terminates at Copper Flat, it's a 9-mile run, 18 miles round trip. The train goes through one tunnel, passes between steep rock canyons, goes by 2 ghost towns, through the Kennecott mining town of Ruth, passes huge copper ore dumps, climbs a steep grade, and arrives on top at Copper Flat. It's an hour-and-a-half ride round trip, and these are some of the highlights of that run. Now, while these pictures from our train-mounted cameras look calm, it's still quite a ride up in front on the engine. There's a considerable degree of motion that pitches you from side to side, but the power-stroking sound of the engine and the rhythm of the pilot wheels clicking on the rails provides an exhilarating sensation of sound. Although we were on relatively flat ground at this point above the town, the firemen began to shovel coal feverishly into the hearth. I had a feeling he knew something was coming that we didn't know about. Here comes the tunnel, But we've got problems. The high railer with the camera in the back has got to slow down, or it will jump the tracks inside the tunnel. And that big old 75-ton engine is not slowing down. Let her go! Well, I decided to give the driver of that high railer a little bit of encouragement to get the heck out of the tunnel before we all became hood ornaments on the front of that big old Baldwin locomotive. As we cleared the tunnel, the grade began to increase sharply, and boy, did that engine work. I cannot possibly impress you with how incredibly hot that fire is when the fireman opens the doors. Those doors are air activated by a foot trundle lever on the deck of the engine. Every time the fireman stokes the fire, that black smoke comes up boiling out of the stack.
Well, when we're starting out of the station, Earl will be working a very light throttle, and that gives, I'll try and build the fire up fairly light and even all around, and as he starts to work the engine harder, I shovel in coal proportionately to the amount the engine works. I also have to balance that against the amount of water that I put in the boiler with my injector, so I don't kill the steam pressure by putting cold water in it and everything. The locomotive will use about 1,000 gallons of water and 1.5 tons of coal in one of our hour-and-a-half excursion rides. So there's a fair amount of shoveling going on and a fair amount of water being used up. As we're going up that steep hill there, it's almost a fairly steady, constant shoveling of coal because the engine is working every ounce of tractive effort. It's being worked extremely hard, and so the fireman has to keep right on top of what the engineer and the power demands of the locomotive are. In the flats, it's more relaxed. I have a chance to watch the scenery go by, and I do my hardest work going up the hill. And then on the way down, it's just very relaxing. You don't have to put any coal in because the locomotive is just drifting.
Nice thing about a steam train, you can see it coming before it gets to you. We were really starting to climb as that black smoke rolls out in a funnel-shaped cloud behind the engine. Under the highway overpass and up past the town of Ruth chuffs the iron horse. To our left, the ore dumps announce our arrival at the copper pits. Now we really start to climb. We're near the top and Copper Flat is in sight. We made it, and the engineer comes off the throttle. The train now backs up onto a siding in preparation for the return trip downhill. To the side, the old mining sheds of Kennecott Copper sit in quiet repose. I thought I'd get a side view of the train, so I jumped off, but I got a little bit more than I bargained for. Oh, yeah, that's what you call letting off a little bit of steam. I quickly moved the camera out of harm's way, wiped off the lens as the engineer continued to vent excess water. They backed up the fire rig in preparation for the return trip, and then we started down the mountain, under the seasoned eye of Buck. You know, he wasn't the oldest Nevada Northern employee we spoke with, but even in retirement, steam was still in his blood.
The steamers? Yeah, well, they were lots more colorful to work on. You had more side motion on them, moving. You had the exhaust, plus you had the hot fire. Just more colorful to work on than the diesels.
T.J. Buck Lanny went to work for the Nevada Northern in 1942.
I was a locomotive engineer. I started out as a fireman on the steamers in 1942. I got promoted to engineer in 1945. I worked up until the time of my retirement, until the time they shut down, which was in 78, Jim?
Yeah.
It was in 78. First, when you first started out a fireman, you had to get the basics of firing the engine, and along with that, you eventually picked up the mechanics of the engine. And before you became a fireman, you had to take a written examination on the book of rules, plus you had to take the written examination on the working of the engine.
Science of locomotive management.
Yeah, science of locomotive management.
And the air.
And the air, yeah, anything pertaining to the engine. And I think when I first started out, if I remember right, I worked 13 days to get what they call my first okay. You work 13 days for free. They give you your first okay. It was good enough. It was good enough for your first okay. And after you got that, You went with a different engineer and got your second one, and then you went from him and got your third one.
Am I hearing reasons why there was finally made a union?
Well, it was a union then. Yeah. Sometimes we used to work as long as 16 hours on them. Come in off an 8-hour shift and get off of one engine, get on another one and take off.
As we pass the old steam shovels and haul-packed dump trucks that once helped move all those mine tailings, you could see it in his eyes. The pride of a man who had made his money the old-fashioned way. Oh no, he didn't just earn a living, he worked for it.
It was a minute late, and I want to know why.
They didn't care much about an hour, but a minute or two, that was really
When I first started,
Interesting.
when I first started running engine, I got a letter. Come back to work one day, and I got a letter from the conductor, and I opened it up. It was from the trainmaster. Says, I noticed by the time sheet yesterday he was 4 minutes late coming off the hill. Says, if you can't do better than that, come to my office and we'll have a talk. So I didn't even go to the office. I just managed to be 4 minutes early all the time.
That's why you used to scare the hell out of me, huh?
When we first come to work here, we put our clothes on before the whistle blew and took them off after. But when I retired, we used to put them on after the whistle blowed and take them off before they blowed.
Is that progress?
Coffee breaks.
You meant to keep your job.
And I started working with the track gang. I didn't even know the English language.
Where did you come from?
Italy.
We sat down with a group of retired Nevada Northern employees to hear their stories. John, who was 83 when this interview was made, came to Ely in 1922 when he was just 17 years old.
Do you remember how much you made back then?
Oh, first when I started with $2.80 a day, 9 hours work, no coffee break, nothing. That's the change been made.
What was it like in the wintertime when it was cold?
Cold. Sometimes the snow was level with the decks of the cars. I remember over across the valley there, if there was a couple of miles, when you'd start down through there, you'd push snow ahead of the engine in a ditch. The track it normally is up on a raise. It was down in a ditch in the snow, and you'd come out of the other end there pushing 100-yard wad of snow ahead of the engine down the track. Sometimes the snow, you hit a snow drift, go clear up, cover the headlight with snow, back in through the cab. Coming in there, the fireman get out and put in a fire because he wouldn't be able to see as soon as he got in the snow. The hot or the cold snow blowing, getting in on that hot boiler just make a cloud of steam that you couldn't see across the cab in. And you just sit and hope, but waiting, it didn't go on the ground. That is, the wheels come off the track. You wouldn't know it till you got out the other side and hit a switch and it'd derail everything, which happened once in a while.
Did that happen in the snow quite a bit?
Well, sometimes I've seen it raise the engine right up off the track, a snowpack in underneath them, and raise them right up off the rails so they wouldn't go. That happened with the diesels more than the steam engines.
Well, I started on the railroad in May the 17th, 1939, in the section labor. And within a year, I had a chance to go to work in the roundhouse as a machinist helper, boilermaker helper, blacksmith helper, and after that, I asked for a chance to go firing. Those days you could
Jack
be a
Marsh
fireman
worked for the
anywhere.
Nevada Northern 46 years.
And I went dispatching for 5 years, and I was promoted to trainmaster in 1963. And I tell you fellows, that is the toughest job you'll ever have, to be a trainmaster. Especially when you've got a bunch of buddies like here that you've got to chew out every time you turn around. But heck with this, they knew their jobs as well as I did,
We
if
pulled his
not
teeth, though.
better. But I got along absolutely great, and they're the greatest bunch of friends I've ever had in my life. And I retired with 10 days back in 46 years, and I do it all over again.